environment a few weeks ago, and that's the reason we have these slides and not some other slides. Is these are the ones that, without power, I could download and then get to Meredith this morning. We don't have power at my house because of a windstorm last night, so we're winging it. The reason that we put together this session is that the IARPC membership in general is aware of a lot of information and research that's ongoing that we may not be, specifically things that could be coming out or being published in the next several months in the lead up to the development of this 5th National Climate Assessment, which I'll get into in a minute. And so the rationale here was to try and get ahead of that information that could be coming out or publications that are emerging so that we don't get left behind as we write the chapter. We want to have it be as current as possible so that the state of change and its effects on people in Alaska is as clear and well developed as it can be. Originally, we were going to have a session at the Arctic Science Summit Week in Tromsø, Norway in a few weeks. But because of the ongoing pandemic, that was switched to a primarily digital meeting, and anyway, we couldn't travel, so we started to find other ways to get that input. And one of the ways to do that is through outreach through IARPC, because the expertise is here to do that. So what I'm going to do is start with a little bit of a slide deck on what the National Climate Assessment is and what the Alaska chapter looks like, so that you can get a feel for where we're at and what information might pertain and be relevant. And then we'll open it up for some discussion, and we want to hear from you about things that are on the horizon or new information that could be included. There have been a couple of public engagement workshops for the chapter where we get input from various interested parties out there in the world, and that comes from everywhere. It's not just Alaska, not just Alaska Native communities, but also from around the country, because as we know, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. So with that, I'll thank you for being here and move on into our slides. So Meredith, if we could have the next slide, please. The National Climate Assessment, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, just saying the next slide is showing.
Yep, thanks. This should be one on the legislative origins for the National Climate Assessment. So what is the National Climate Assessment? If you're familiar with like the IPCC reports that come out about every 5 or 6 years or so, this is similar, but it's focused on the United States instead of the whole planet. And the Global Change Research Act of 1990 has in it a stipulation that says essentially that every 4 years, the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP, will prepare and submit to the President and Congress an assessment that does the following things. And there's a whole list of effects of global change on various aspects of the environment and human dimensions of that environment. And the idea here is that a lot of this information is relevant and actionable by various agencies, some of them science agencies like NSF or NASA, some of them management agencies like the Department of the Interior or others. And this assessment's gotten to the point where the information that's presented in it tends to drive the development of policy and the development of research, at least in part, around the country for the next several years. And so we take it seriously because people do listen. Sometimes there's not as much traction as we might hope on certain issues, but I think you get the idea. What is an assessment? First of all, it's not a new research project. Instead, it's an evaluation of the body of knowledge that applies the best professional judgment of the people doing the assessment to bridge the uncertainties that are out there. So rather than concrete outcomes from a specific project and a list of results, it instead provides a survey of many such results and what they mean for people and their interest. The assessments are consensus-based, so there's a very rigorous process by which the language gets developed and by which content is used to support the arguments in the assessment and the statements in the assessment. And it kind of looks at the state of the science, where we are, but also what's needed. They're relevant for policy and decision making, but they don't prescribe policy interventions or advocate for a particular viewpoint. And this is a key threshold or line in the sand when we do an assessment. We don't get to say what we think should be done differently. Instead, we say, here are the changes and what could be done differently, but we can't advocate for any of those specific changes. That is the job of Congress, the executive branch of the government instead. sorry, I forgot to talk about advancing the slide. We should move to slide 4, which is priorities for NCA 5. So this is the 5th time around for National Climate Assessment. And the first sort of zero order priority is to say what's different since NCA 4, NCA 3, and the prior assessments. The kind of tone and content of these assessments has evolved over time as the impacts of climate change and other related changes on the planet become clearer, but then also because the impacts and risks for people and managed resources become clearer. So the first one is kind of to advance the conversation, take the next step beyond where we were 4 or 5 years ago in 2017 when the previous NCA was released. They increasingly want to make it accessible to a broad audience. The audience shouldn't just be, fellow researchers. It shouldn't just be people with a really high level of understanding of these systems or the policies that govern them. Instead, it needs to be accessible to a very broad audience. And so the language is tailored again and again and again to reach a broader audience, to be accessible to more of the public, because it's thought that the more people understand and are aware of it, the more likely it is to actually have some traction. It also wants to be creative in its communication, recognizing that the standard approaches that scientists use to communicate with each other are not always as effective for others. There's a lot of emphasis on good graphics and illustrations that both educate and communicate the nature of the changes, but then also, make them more relevant to people other than just scientists. They want to make it about people. It really isn't just about, the way that scientists often view the world. It wants to be very human-centric. An example of that is instead of saying climate change of 3 degrees centigrade planetary average has these impacts on these systems, and then, oh, by the way, it affects people this way. Instead, it says people are experiencing these risks. Those are affected by climate change, and developing the argument that way. And then finally, to ensure that it's useful and usable. The idea is that the data and information that come out of these efforts need to be actionable by a wide range of entities, but they also have to be accessible and usable by others. It can't just be a whole bunch of data in formats that are only accessible by scientists and professionals that work in the data world. It has to be much more accessible than that. Okay, next slide. Where are we in this process? This all began in 2020, 2021, in terms of the development of the structure and teams for writing the chapters and developing the leadership around the country. This is part of an almost sustained process at this point. As soon as one of these assessments is done, it's time to ramp up the foundations for the next one in terms of the staffing and capacity. These things have a way of wearing out the people who coordinate and run the show, less so the authors who have a lighter lift than the people who coordinate the policy and structural dimensions of it. Where we're at now is that the author teams have been assigned, and the basic content of each of the chapters has been approved. And at its most basic, this is a sentence or two. And then the various chapters are working on the writing, and there's public engagement workshops ongoing to provide input on what should be covered, what should be in addition to the things that the authors have so far suggested. Next slide, please. The future steps as we move forward into the spring of 2022, the first draft, which is roughly 60% developed by the leadership's definition, needs to be actually in hand within the next few days. The development then further goes through several separate review processes, and the authors respond to the comments from those different review processes through the spring and summer of 2023. And then eventually all of this stuff gets released. There's a coordinated website development that goes with it, and it's published ideally by the fall of 2023. Now, the process by which new information gets incorporated in this depends on when it comes out. And so in theory, things that are going to be published by the fall of 2022, winter 2023, it's easy to cite those things in the development, or sorry, in the chapters. As we get further into spring of 2023, then it's much harder to include that information, and we have to be aware of it ahead of time, hence this call. Next slide, please. The chapter team for the Alaska chapter looks like this, and I'm not going to go through all the details here, but all of these people have either several expertises, several areas of expertise for Alaska, or are focused on a very specific aspect of it in depth. But there's a structure of leadership at the top that starts with the chapter lead, Henry Huntington. He's the person who's coordinating the actual writing and doing the work of herding all of the contributing authors and authors. But then there's a federal lead author and agency lead authors that help buffer the writing team from the agencies that oversee all of this. And that's to remain in compliance with things like FACA and having the federal and scientific communities coordinate appropriately so that we're not having too much of a direct influence on policy that could come of this and minimize the conflicts of interest and that sort of thing. Anyway, there's a wide range of authors here, federal authors, academic authors, NGO authors, and even some folks from industry. So it has a very broad authorship. It's also the most diverse author team I've ever seen for one of these assessments. It's really great to be working with this group of people, and it's been a lot of fun so far. Next slide. The chapter overview at its simplest is pretty much just three things. One of them is something we all know on this call, but biophysical change as a function of climate change is really rapid in Alaska, faster in the Arctic in general than the rest of the planet, than the lower 48, and thus the impacts are more pressing in some ways than in other places, although not exclusively. Alaska faces a lot of societal stressors, and climate change exacerbates many of them directly and indirectly. The idea here is that the decision context faced by Alaska Native communities, by federal land management agencies, by municipalities, by state agencies, everybody in Alaska is operating in a slightly different world in many ways than the ones people in the lower 48 are familiar with. And in part, that has to do with the very late colonization and then development of the state from a Western perspective. And so things look different here. We have a different history, but we also have different social impacts of climate change, both because it's fast and it's a different place. And then the third main piece of that is that adaptation efforts are underway, but that's 4 words that describe a huge diversity of efforts. And it really depends on where and what you're working on as to what that adaptation looks like and what it needs to look like. The decision context, as I said earlier, are really diverse. And so the adaptation efforts are also equally, if not more diverse. And so who is doing what and what needs to happen in the near term is a key piece of this assessment. And we really want to have as much information as we can on that. Okay, next slide. The key focal areas, the key topics, I told you earlier that this is a human-focused assessment. They want to lead with the impacts on people and the stories and the storylines that affect people specifically, rather than from the direct natural system impacts first. And so it's health, it's communities, livelihoods, infrastructure, natural environment, security, adaptation. All of these are key topics that are woven throughout the assessment. It isn't like they're broken off into their individual silos. We deal with it and then we move on. We all know that these things are interconnected, in many cases deeply so, and you can't really talk about the impacts on one without bringing in the impacts on some of the others. And it's especially true in Alaska, where people have food security issues associated with changes to subsistence species or things like that. And so the idea here is that these ideas, these aspects have to be woven through the chapter as a whole. Next slide, please. The key themes, there's a whole list of them here, but it starts with, why is Alaska different? And many of you on the call already have some idea of this, but then there's a whole list of themes, and there are authors on the chapter team that are specialists in each one of these. Each of us only brings a part of the story to the writing. But even with an author team of, a dozen people or more, it's not enough perspective to tackle all of this. And that's part of the reason that we're reaching out in these public engagement workshops, but also asking people like you to help us figure out what new information is on the horizon that we need to be aware of and potentially include in the chapter. Okay, that's all I got. That's a little bit of a fire hose, a real quick introduction to the assessment and where we're headed. But with that, what I'd like to do is open it up for some discussion. And, you know, your contribution could be things that you think we should specifically be looking at as examples to cover, you know, that help communicate the nature of changes in Alaska. We'd really like to hear if you know of any research or publications that are emerging soon that we wouldn't already have access to or wouldn't be aware of for one reason or another, that sort of thing. So anything that you think we ought to hear. And I know I'm not able to moderate chat or anything like that, but I'm hoping Meredith can help navigate this as well. I think since we're a small group, it should be relatively easy to do it without speaking all over each other, but that would be great.
Jeremy, I can help pay attention to any comments that come in the chat for you.
Thank you.
We've had one comment, which is from Rob, who says, can we share the slides? Are they somewhere that's accessible?
Absolutely.
Oh, here they are. Meredith's already put it in.
There we go.
All right.
Yes.
Well, Jeremy, I appreciated this talk. I think it's really interesting to hear more about what the NCA 5 is trying to do, and especially looking at the different themes and how it's structured around people. You know, NASA's doing a lot with above, and so I almost think I need to kind of go back and look and see. I guess it's, you know, it's good to know what's in it already to see if there's other things that I should kind of give to you later that would be useful.
Well, it's funny you should ask me that, because that section on the natural environment, and especially the terrestrial side of it, and when we say terrestrial, that's mostly land surface, vegetation, surface hydrology, but a little bit into the freshwater aquatic side of things. So anything that bridges that, like, you know, habitat for anadromous fish or things like that, that's the part that I'm tasked with putting on paper, you know, with input from others, but I'm supposed to be the author that does that along a little bit with Jeff Falke, right? He's our expert on freshwater systems. But anything that you want to shove our way, that's, you know, I'm aware of a fair amount of the above stuff, but I can't keep track of all of it. So please do.
Okay, and we have some syntheses, which you know, it sounds like you're really needing things that are finished kind of by fall of this year, more or less.
Yeah, I think the timeline that I saw said that it has to be submitted by, and now I can go look up these dates for you, but it's no later than mid 2022, so like by June or something.
Okay.
But then there's a really long fuse on how long it actually takes to get published.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if it has to meet all of those. Like, does it have to be submitted by June of 2022 and then also published by, you know, some date in 2023? And we all know the publication timeline can vary from, you know, weeks to forever. And so I can look into that in depth. But in theory, yes, in that window between, say, June of 2022 and I feel like it's March of 2023, that sort of 6 months. Is that 6? No, it's more than that. That's like 9 months. Then it needs to see the light of day by then. Otherwise, we can't really cite it.
Mm-hmm.
We can do something a little odd. So these chapters, like the Alaska chapter is 10,000 words, which is fairly long. Some of the sectoral chapters are only 5,000 words, which is shorter, like a science paper. But then there's this added information called the traceable accounts. And these are the places where the arguments are built for, you know, the confidence that we have in the change itself, and the probabilities or likelihoods that go with the impacts that we're talking about. And in those, then there's a little wiggle room to build logical arguments that don't have strong citation records. So, like, if we knew something was coming out from above, and that it, you know, it was going to be rock solid, we could actually start to build that logical argument, and then it just wouldn't get cited in time. But what would then happen is the chapter would look really good, and the above stuff would look really good because it, you know, it was published right afterwards. if that was the case. But I think you kind of get a feel for the gray area there.
Jeremy?
This is, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Go ahead,
Liz.
Elizabeth. No, your turn.
Yeah, you know, right now we're talking about publications that can be cited by the for this next the NCA 5. I'm wondering, how much are we also trying to understand what are some emerging science themes, or what are some science needs to help provide more information to this? So we may not have publications that may be cited, but there may be efforts underway, or we may be able to identify some information gaps or knowledge gaps that could help inform how Arctic residents adapt to climate change. So I'm just wondering, how much are you looking for citations versus ideas or emerging science themes that would be useful in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the original purpose of our meeting was going to be, the stuff that would become a citation. On the other hand, there's room in the chapter to say, here are the gaps that we see. Like a classic one, I think that's been maybe in the last 2 NCAs and will again be here, is that it's not enough to talk about permafrost thaw, coastal erosion, community vulnerability, and relocation separately. You need a stream of science products that informs then the dialogue and adaptation potential for each community. And that stuff is starting to emerge, but it's still not there yet. And some communities have an edge on others in terms of, their access to such local information. And so that's the kind of thing where it's clear that the adaptation potential can't really proceed as quickly as it might without some of the knowledge. Or you could also argue that the knowledge that's being developed isn't quite exactly what the adaptation process really needs, right? And so if you could outline those, and so we can throw in a sentence that said, here's what's absolutely needed, that's a good thing for the chapter to be doing, because it has that potential to motivate policy. You just then have to have it rest on a foundation that's quite logical, right? And we can do that.
Absolutely.
So,
and that's kind of why I bring up that question, because I'm hoping that we don't just think about, well, what are some of the cool papers or the new publications that are coming out, but looking at the state of the science now and the information is needed. Where are some of those critical gaps that the research community or the science community and social scientists and Arctic residents can kind of work together to address certain questions like you just had outlined. So where will the science go? And then I would hope that this NCA 5 could also then be used as ideas, like generating ideas to then pursue funding for addressing some of the issues that you had just outlined.
well, and that's, since we're on an IARPC call here, it's probably incumbent on us to also mention that the Arctic research plan that's just been released and that outlines IARPC's activities for the next several years is very much such a document. It's focused in a different way than the NCA is, and for slightly different purposes, but there's a lot of overlap there, right?
Yes, I agree. And for those who aren't familiar, the Arctic research plan that's being released has 4 main priority areas. And what I've seen Jeremy present on some of the themes that are going to be outlined in NCA 5, I think there's a lot of overlap and similarity, and that that they aren't just silos topics, but we're really trying to get at not just the biophysical, but then also the impacts to communities, and then how we can take it a step further with adaptation efforts.
And we have a few slides a little later on that are going to talk about the research plan a little bit too. Oh, and Meredith just put it in the chat. She is on top of that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Meredith.
So I'm interested to hear from the rest of you. Are any of you doing some, research that would be relevant? I know some of you said you were in school right now. Is there research that might kind of hit some of these themes that Jeremy was talking about for the NCA 5? Yeah, just go ahead and unmute and talk, Catherine.
Catherine here. I don't have any research, but I was just thinking of a question as Elizabeth Powers was talking about some of the advances of science and cutting edge areas that are being pursued. How well do policymakers and government officials understand where the science is? So I mean, you know, if you attend like I do sometimes and immediately get lost, the model building collaboration team, or you think about how the RCPs 4.5 and 8.5 are kind of common lingo among scientists. How much do the policy makers and congressional leaders who read these things every 5 years understand, you know, where we were 5 years ago and where we are now? Certainly they don't need to, you know, understand the intricacies of what's on the cutting edge of science, but how do they appreciate the gains that we've made? I think is the best way to do that, to say that. Thanks.
That's a great question. Maybe we'll start with this fact. NCA 4 was released, well, originally it was going to be released Friday after Thanksgiving. That tells you one thing. And then it actually moved on and was released instead during the AGU, American Geophysical Union Conference, to try and increase its visibility once again. But what that's telling you is that there was a sort of vie for control of the messaging that went along with NCA 4 because it was released under the prior administration, and they wanted to see if they could bury it. So to the extent that there are you know, civil servants that work either in you know, the legislative branch or the executive branch across administrations, there are quite a few people, especially some of the trusted staffers for some of the congressional representatives, who keep pace with these developments and pay attention to them in the long term. The turnover in other aspects of government is high enough that that's not always the case. So it really depends, I think, on the context and who you're talking about. I think in almost all cases, when we communicate this stuff, we have to assume a pretty strong unfamiliarity with it, at least to get people grounded quickly. There's a huge attempt to try and take it out of the world of, you know, modeling and databases and the typical science products and move it much more towards you know, deliberate communication. And there's a communication staff, a whole technical services unit for the NCA that tries to make certain that happens. You can imagine that with, you know, a couple dozen chapters and a whole bunch of other associated information, that it's very difficult for them to do that equally effectively everywhere all the time. But they do a really good job. And so, for example, last time, you know, NCA 4, often what happens is the like congressional staffers for Congress members have, you know, trusted connections in the science world or the science and policy world that they then go to and say, you know, what does this mean? What's different? And so there's a lot of back channel communications that happen to make it as effective as it can be. But then NCA specifically focuses lots of briefings. They get people who maybe have a science background or who were once scientists but have a lot more communications training or expertise to do a lot of that translation, rather than relying on the author teams themselves to do it. And that often makes it more effective as well. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
Any others?
Jeremy, more of a question of how the team is pulling together information for this NCA 5 chapter. You mentioned you want to like frame it or focus on people and impacts to people. I'm wondering if your team or the authors on the team are reaching out to Arctic residents, or if you're looking at some of the recently published climate adaptation reports or community resilience reports to get an understanding of, you know, some of the needs that are identified in those adaptation efforts or those community resilience efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. we had a fair amount of community input in the information and public engagement workshop that we put on at AFE, Alaska Forum on the Environment. There's also been a deliberate selection of authors to focus on those topics. And there are at least 4 of the authors that I think have that as kind of a core piece of what they do. Darcy Peter, Danielle Meeker, Kana, I'm going to try to say Kana's last name appropriately, but I think it's Chuyak, and then Adelaide Herman from UAF. All 4 of them focus on that community adaptation aspect of climate change in Alaska. And they do it from different angles, but there's a specific inclusion of those perspectives in the chapter and framing it actually around them. And I don't know if you know Henry Huntington, but Henry's a card-carrying social scientist, is long roots in Alaska, but has a lot of trust in many of the communities around the state where he's done work, and so he's made sure that theme is, or those themes, I should say, are clearly represented. I think the chapter evolution since NCA 3, we did better in NCA 4 than NCA 3 on that front by focusing more on adaptation and the variation in community responses. But I think this time you'll see it really come to the front.
Okay, great. Thank you. Yeah, I'm just looking at the list of authors right now, and it's kind of hard to tell based on the titles or their affiliation, and when it just says UAF, what their specific role might be. So thanks for the clarification. I was just going to suggest that potentially you take a look at, some of the recently published adaptation reports or community resilience or outcomes from those workshops to kind of get a better handle on some of the community needs. And similarly, if I don't know if there's been any outreach to decision makers or land managers or community planners on maybe some of the challenges they're facing to plan or make decisions. That might be another way to get feedback. But I would imagine your group is already on top of that.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that one runs into a little bit of a sticky legal dimension where we have to have transparent communication with agency land managers anyway. Because if they drive the content of the report or we tailor the report to meet only their needs, then we run afoul of some of the limitations on the dialogue here. That said, the first review process that the NCA chapters go through is a federal agency review where the various management agencies get to pipe up and say, well, you didn't include these 25 things that we would like to see in the chapter. And admittedly, in Alaska, we got less of that than, say, like the forest chapter, where I'm also working. And that one, there's just like hundreds of comments about what wasn't included. Like, you need to do this, and this. And, some of them are indicative, right? It's like people want you to include this and other people don't want you to. So
yeah, yep.
That process is, we have to be careful there. But yes, you're right. I think a lot of these authors are aware of those challenges, and especially the ones that are general and kind of felt by everyone. Then we need to get that information in the chapter. But we can't then say it affects these entities, these management agencies disproportionately. We can say that about communities, right? We could not say it about tribal corporations, for example, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out, I'm understanding that it's kind of a delicate, or you just have to be very careful about how you get that input. But, I'm just thinking in terms of like decisions when federal or state managers have to make decisions about fisheries and whether it's commercial or whether it's subsistence, it does impact the residents within Alaska. So how do we understand what are the key, what are some of the knowledge gaps or information they may need to better manage fisheries or make decisions that then impacts Arctic residents? So I'm just trying to figure out how we could get that feedback to inform what may be included in the NCA 5 chapter.
Yeah, I think the research needs aspect of it can only go so far within the chapter. It's much more focused on the state of knowledge. some important gaps, like I said, that apply to everybody could be advanced there, but getting as specific as knowledge gaps needed to manage fisheries, that then all of a sudden we've got the ADF&G and NOAA. We have Libby Lagerwell as a NOAA author here, and she's tasked with that a little bit, but we'd have to be super careful about getting it down to that level.
Sure. So it's just,
I think
a
it's
little
really
bit too much detail for the NCA 5 chapter.
Yeah, it's really easy. For example, so we've got an author from the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, one from NOAA who deals with similar issues. I'm trying to remember if there's another, and then Jeff Falke at USGS, right? They all approach those from slightly different angles. And it would be easy to say, communities around the state are having trouble because of the failure of Chinook and then less so other anadromous fisheries, right? And that's a big deal. It has these cultural and food security dimensions. We can say that. And then we can say there are things about, the open ocean and also freshwater habitats of the anadromous fish life cycle that aren't known. They look like this. These things need to be known before management can, tailor adaptation responses for different river reaches around the state. So it could look like that, but we couldn't then go and say ADF&G needs to do this and NOAA needs to do this. And NOAA needs to know this, ADF&G needs to know this, right? We couldn't, I don't think we could do that.
Yeah, I think, and I completely understand that you need to state the knowledge gaps and the needs more broadly and not tied to a specific agency or a specific entity.
Well, thank you for this overview, Jeremy. I have some information that I think might be helpful as you're working on your writing. Above just has been working on a midpoint overview paper for what we've done and what some of our knowledge gaps are. So I think some of that could be helpful for the natural environment section you're working on. So I'll pass that along to you. We're still kind of working on it now, but we have a draft that we've put up on our website so I could share it. And
that would be great.
It's kind of like got all of our recent research in it, plus kind of what our syntheses are that we're working on, and then even what we think our knowledge gaps are based on what we've been learning. So
thanks. That's perfect.
Well, you only have a little bit more than 10 minutes left, so I don't know if we want to transition to our next thing.
Yeah, let's do that.
Maybe. Do we want to open it up one more time to see if there's any additional comments or ideas from the group before we move on?
Yeah.
Could also dump my email in the chat, or all three of our emails in the chat. Meredith, if you could do that, that'd be awesome. And then people, if you're feeling overwhelmed because of the fire hose of information, something occurs to you later, go ahead and pass it on, please.
And I know we have a smaller group today, and a lot of times we'll have a speaker and then a discussion, but we're trying this year to kind of use this working group to do a few more things. And so providing kind of thoughts and ideas towards this NCA 5 is one of the things we were working on. And then we'll see as Meredith presents some slides, we have some other ideas to kind of help us provide comments to IARPC and on what we think is important for terrestrial ecology. So we got a small group today, but we appreciate all of you coming and kind of hearing what we're doing today.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And I will just share briefly with everyone. I'm actually just going to share the this screen here. And so this is a link that I shared in the chat, which goes to the Arctic Research Plan webpage. Sorry about that. And has a lot of information, but I think that this graphic is really helpful for getting a sense of what the Arctic Research Plan, how it's structured, and then kind of what we're asking for now. So the Arctic Research Plan came out was released to the public in December of 2021, so just a couple of months ago, and it has these different sections to it that, as kind of we spoke about before, it's structured very differently than previous Arctic research plans, which were pretty siloed by discipline, and this terrestrial ecosystems team is actually an artifact of that. The previous structure, there were different chapters with terrestrial, coastal resilience, health, and now we're kind of trying to integrate across disciplines through this different framework here. So in the red, you see the 4 different priority areas: community, resilience and health, Arctic systems interactions, sustainable economies and livelihoods, and risk management and hazard mitigation. And then on the bottom, there are 5 foundational activities. So these are things that are important to each of the priority areas for them to be successful. And so the Arctic Research Plan has been published, but if you read it, you'll notice that it's very high level and is a kind of a bold new vision, but a lot of the on the ground details are not included in this plan. So that's what we're working on now, is creating more of the implementation of how actually to work towards the goals, which are in the priority areas. And so the terrestrial ecosystems team is working to do that from their end, and they have created a survey to kind of help get input from this community on ways that the terrestrial ecosystems research community could align under the new plan, and what activities you all are interested, excited about, and would want to do under the new plan. So I will pause there and let the other team leaders jump in with any other information, and I can also share the link to the survey that they've created.
You're muted, Elizabeth.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, I think maybe I would just add, we've developed a survey based on some of the other collaboration teams have sent out a survey to their collaboration teams, and this will go to the entire, all participants or members of the terrestrial ecosystems collaboration team. And essentially what we're trying to do is seek input, as we look at this new Arctic research plan. It's organized in a very different way than the last Arctic research plan that was more disciplinary in focus, where we identify research objectives related to more or less terrestrial ecosystems. And now the new Arctic research plan is focused on essentially 4 cross-cutting priority areas. And now we're seeking input on how our terrestrial ecosystem collaboration team can maybe align with those priorities and maybe seek new opportunities for collaboration or develop new goals for this team to pursue. So we're looking for your feedback on, some ideas for new performance elements or new science objectives that we could coordinate around that would align with this new Arctic research plan. So just a little bit of background with this, I'll just provide a little overview of the survey that we're seeking. There's a front page. If you see the link for the survey, you'll see that there's a little bit of a background about the 4 priority areas and the high level objectives that are outlined under each priority area. And then if you scroll down, you'll get into the actual survey, which is what work is happening or should be happening. So we ask open-ended questions related to each of the priority area. So for example, the first objective under a goal, improve community resilience and well-being by strengthening research and developing tools to increase understanding of independent social natural built systems in the Arctic. Under that objective, there are open-ended questions of what work is happening or should happen related to evaluating threats to food safety and security, and develop solutions to improve availability of subsistence and market-based foods. So this is an open-ended question where you can think about the type of work that you're doing that could contribute to this, or new ideas for research that could help contribute to this objective. So we're asking that each person provide feedback. You don't have to answer every question if you don't see an alignment or your work may not align with it, but we definitely are seeking feedback. So we'd appreciate if you could complete the survey, and hopefully you can all access that link that Meredith put in there.
We gave everybody until March 14th, so you have a little bit of time to do it, but if you have time today, you should just do it right now. And as Elizabeth mentioned, they are open-ended, and you don't need to respond to all of them. You can respond to just the ones that are relevant to your work or what you think the terrestrial ecosystems team should really be focusing on. So this is just our way to provide input, and we have to provide our input to IARPC, I think no later than kind of like a few days after we've asked all of you. I think we have to provide it by like the 18th of or so of March. So we've asked for it by the 14th because we need to collate it and provide it right after that.
Yeah, I think the plan, maybe this has shifted, but I think the plan is to in March to have at least part of terrestrial ecosystems team meeting that goes over the results of the survey and just had like further discussion on that.
And I also thought just to follow up, this survey will also help us realign our performance elements. So each collaboration team has a series of performance elements or essentially goals that they're going to be working towards that we track over the life cycle of the Arctic Research Plan. So the co-leads are going to be evaluating the current performance elements or the performance elements from the last Arctic Research Plan and evaluating whether or not we need to change them, modify them, or add new ones. So this survey will definitely help us kind of reassign new performance elements as needed and maybe help shape the direction of what we focus on in the next 5 years. So your input is much appreciated.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. And thank you, Jeremy, for presenting, even though you didn't have any power, and you've really gone above and beyond there. Thank you.
Well, thanks for all of you for making the time to join and contribute. Much appreciated.
All right. We hope to see you all next month.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks.
Thanks.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.